Ernst Roets, welcome to The Next Generation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show.
How did I do with the pronunciation?
That was actually perfect.
Good.
A lot of people struggle with the pronunciation, and I've gotten used to it. But as you pronounced it, Ernst is the correct pronunciation, so well done.
What is a Dummies guide to the current lay of the land in South African politics?
Well, that is a very good question, and it's a very important question. And the reason why it's so important is because if you ask different people, you will certainly get different answers. I would say the Dummies guide is that the core of the problem that one needs to understand about the problem in South Africa, that most analysts tend not to talk about, is that we have a particular reality in South Africa and we have a particular political system in South Africa, and these two do not match. I remember growing up 3 years old, these toys that you give kids, toddlers to play with, where you have the different shapes and you have to find the correct shape and put it in the correct hole. That to me is a good analogy of South Africa. Like the South African reality is something like a square and the political system is something like a triangle. And it's a good political system, but it doesn't quite fit with the reality. And I think that's the source of a lot of problems. And what I mean, sort of the short version of what I mean by that, is the political system is very liberal democratic. It's built on the idea, it was very inspired by the German constitution. A lot of people don't know that. But it's built on the idea of individual rights exclusively. So we're all South African citizens. We're all individuals living within South Africa. And as if cultural dynamics and cultural preferences and languages and so forth don't really matter that much. But in reality, these things do matter. And people, there are different communities in South Africa who think differently about solutions, who think differently about problems, who think differently about the role of the government, what the government should do and shouldn't do, and so forth. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the one is right and the one is wrong. It just means that there are different preferences. But this leads to friction. And the assumption was that within a new South Africa, if you sort of just force everyone together as the antithesis to the apartheid system, which was forcing everyone to live separately, then eventually people will get used to each other and we would see a sort of loosening of friction. But what's happening in South Africa currently is that we see friction escalating. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's not sufficient recognition for community dynamics in South Africa.
Well, you make that clear distinction of the system being okay, but they're not matching up to reality.
Yeah.
Why do you make that distinction? Surely you can't separate the two if it's not matching up to the reality. What is going wrong then?
So there has been some studies on this, and I have mentioned this in some podcasts before. A study about the question of whether democracy leads to quality of government. And I'm very much in favor of democracy. I think the problem that we have in South Africa is we have a very narrowly defined conception of democracy. And it's presented as the only acceptable view of democracy. And if you don't agree with this view, then you are somehow anti-democratic or illiberal or undemocratic. And the problem is, so this particular study I mentioned was, the question is, can you say that a country is better governed if the political system is democracy, or more particularly liberal democracy? And the question is, it depends on the country, or that's the answer at least, the conclusion that the researchers found. And some of the things, there are many variables they looked at, but two of the important variables is, one is what is the economic state of that country? Because democracy is essentially a supply and demand system. You need to have a demand from the people for a particular type of government, and you need to have a party or a movement that says, we fit the bill, vote for us. And so, but in a country that is very poor, people tend to vote for political solutions that focus on short-term results. And you can't necessarily blame people for that. If you don't have food on the table and you have this party saying, vote for us and we'll give you social grants, there's a high probability that people would vote for that.
Well, for them, it's now or never.
Yes, exactly. So it's not to say that there's something fundamentally wrong with the people, but there's an immediate need. And there's a party that says, well, we're a socialist movement, so we'll just take from the rich and give to the poor. And then people say, well, maybe this is the solution. But the problem with that type of approach is it places no emphasis on long-term investment, on policies that's necessary to grow the economy in the long run. And so part of the answer is that in poor countries, a very direct type of democracy tends to lead to more socialism and tends to lead to economic policies that are not good for the country, which is ironic. And then the other part of the answer is that democracy tends to lead to more stable societies in countries that are more homogenous, and tends to lead to more friction in countries that are more diverse, that have more, like in South Africa, we have 11 or 12 official languages if you count sign language as one of the official languages. So it's a very diverse country, but this particular democracy that we have in South Africa, again, doesn't recognize community dynamics. But the reality is that people tend to vote in terms of community dynamics. So they tend to vote for a party that speaks the same language as them and so forth. And so what ends up happening is communities that are bigger in sheer numbers end up dominating communities that are smaller under the banner of democracy. And then you have communities, smaller communities like the Afrikaans-speaking community or the Afrikaner community saying, but we feel marginalized, we feel that our minority rights are not protected. And then the so-called majority would just say, well, this is democracy, get used to it. So you have to, get in line. And so this necessarily leads to a friction that needs to be dealt with. And our system doesn't cater for dealing with these type of frictions.
Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all other alternatives.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, the famous Churchill line. That's exactly it. Yes.
Is it Churchill or is it someone else? There's this thing of Churchillian drift where quotes get attributed to Churchill always, even if they weren't his. But yes. I'm sure that one actually is his.
Yeah,
it sounds very Churchill.
I think that was Churchill, but yes, you're right. So I've actually quoted Churchill on things only to see that it was actually Cicero who said it. But yeah, so but I believe it was Churchill who said that, yes.
McGatwade speaks about this a lot, how Africa and loads of parts of Africa are poor because of socialism. That's one of the key factors she attributes to poverty in large portions of Africa. And yet we see people keeping on going down this route of pursuing socialist causes.
Yep.
And it's a tale as old as time, right? You see this especially in the last century, actual implementation of socialism on major scales. You see the Soviet Union, you see communist China. And we seem to never learn our lessons from history. Even just looking at my generation, Gen Z, I can't remember the percentage now off the top of my head, but a large percentage of Gen Z would be in favour of a strong leader coming into Parliament in the UK, unbound by democracy and by Parliament, which is absurd to me. What's the temperature of the water like? You've already alluded to the fact that people are still pursuing these socialist policies, but what's the trajectory you see going forwards? Is it going to keep on getting more and more extreme, or are people going to turn the ship around?
Yeah, so I think on the socialism thing, it's almost like a whirlpool or a vicious circle, in the sense that the easy part to identify is that people are poor because of socialism. But the other part of the story is that there is socialism because the people are poor. And so how do you break the cycle? And it goes back to the point that people who are poor, who don't have opportunities to work, tend to prefer socialism as the way out, because socialism implies, getting stuff. The government intervenes, it takes from the rich, Robin Hood type policy. And so it's a vicious circle, and it's not that easy to break through this. And I think there's an interesting comment to be made here about how many African countries responded to globalization or to increased awareness or interaction with the West, as opposed to the Japanese story, which is famously told in the Last Samurai, or not the Last Samurai, the Last Samurai, the movie with Tom Cruise. So it's the story of a community or a nation or a society that has a particular cultural proclivity or approach that then becomes confronted with the notion of modernization and the necessity to modernize, and which leads to friction. And so there's a Kenyan philosopher, Ali Mazrui, who wrote about this, who said that the problem with Africa and many African countries is they took the wrong lessons from the West. And what he meant by that is they took the materialism, the consumerism from the West, the McDonald's and Nike shoes and so forth, but not so much the entrepreneurial spirit that comes with that. The Japanese, in a certain sense, went the other way around. The Japanese, from a sort of an economic perspective, they modernized in terms of technology and so forth. And I'm not an expert on Japan, but that's at least an analysis that makes sense. But culturally, the Japanese are still very much Japanese and distinct in a particular way. And I think this is one of the problems that many African countries, but especially sub-Saharan Africa and especially South Africa are grappling with is still trying to figure out how to respond to this interaction with the West and the Western way of thinking that has become so dominant. And it's not something that you cannot choose to ignore it, even if you want to. And this leads to friction, and it leads to a lot of friction in the South African context with political parties saying openly, even not just parties, like the former state president saying everything that is wrong with South Africa could be traced back to the day on which Jan van Riebeeck arrived in South Africa, the Dutch who came to start the refreshment station in 1652, and making comments like the way democracy is supposed to work is if you are in the majority, you should have more rights than when you are in the minority. And so there's this very strong antagonism built into politics in South Africa that is very much an antagonism towards the West. And it's a bit complicated in the sense that a lot of this antagonism is well-deserved because the West has done some really atrocious things, and Western imperialism is not a good thing. But a particular narrative was created where you are only allowed to say bad things about the West. You can only talk about the dark side of Western imperialism. But if you talk about what the West has brought to a country like South Africa, then that becomes controversial and you're not allowed to talk about that. But I think to get to your question, broadly speaking, I think most people in South Africa want to get along, and you don't experience racism when you go to a shopping mall in South Africa. But politically speaking, this comes to the fore, the fact that there are different approaches, people think about solutions differently. And politicians obviously like to capitalize on this. And then it manifests in very tangible ways, like, the chanting of kill the Boer, kill the farmer, policies that are aimed at targeting certain communities, taking their property and so forth. And this just escalates, it worsens the friction, it doesn't improve it.
Well, to paint a picture here, we've got 50% of all water being wasted in South Africa from leakages in poor piping.
Yep.
I saw somewhere, it was about the train tracks running from Port Elizabeth. There's this chart of the best and worst railways in the world, and it's like 365 long, and Port Elizabeth ranked 365 or something crazy. And you've got 32% unemployment rate here. So things are going wrong.
No
absolutely. One can lie and say that things are going well. And to your point earlier, there is division on certain topics. There is a lot of division, especially in politics, maybe more so than in reality. And we can get into all of that. But I want to dig into why that divide is there. And I think the only way to do that is to take it right back, and not just to 1652 when the settlers arrived. I want to get an idea of what South Africa was like before that.
Yes. So no, I think you're absolutely right. I made a post on X recently, which I thought was quite funny. Just two clips next to each other. One was a politician of the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, talking at a rally, and the other one was a member of parliament for the ANC, the ruling party, speaking in parliament. And they were both talking about history, the history of South Africa. And I think firstly that's important because we're all defined by history more than we would like to admit, more than some of us would like to admit. But the funny part about that is how we are defined by history and how we want to be defined by history, oftentimes without knowing what that history is. So if you compare these two clips, the one is this EFF, which is the more radical movement in South Africa, talking about how Jan van Riebeeck, who has become this sort of figurehead of white oppression because he was the leader of the Dutch group that came to South Africa in 1652. And so this person said,
our problem started in 1913 when our Jan van Riebeeck came and took our land from our
Van Riebeeck came in 1913 and took our land, which of course he came in 1652. And the other person said Jan van Riebeeck came 2,000 years ago.
As they did in 2,000 years ago by the person named Van Riebeeck. He overstayed.
So the only thing that they know is that Jan van Riebeeck existed and he took someone's land. But one believes he lived 2,000 years ago and the other one believes he lived like 90 years ago. But South Africa, if we really want to go back to, you could say the beginning, of course, you can say when's really the beginning. If you really want to go back to the real beginning, most anthropologists would say that people come from Africa. There's a place in South Africa that's marketed as the cradle of humankind, where it is believed that this is sort of where humanity began. There's a place in East Africa where people say this is actually where humanity began, and that people or civilizations as we know it today who live all over the world actually originated in Africa and then spread throughout. So that's if you really want to go as far back as you possibly could. But as far as South Africa is concerned, there really is only one broad group that could be described as the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just one group, it's different. So you could say tribes. It's oftentimes internationally called the Bushmen. And some people would say that's a derogatory term, but the people who I know who are part of that community actually prefer that term. They prefer to be called Bushmen. Made famous by the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, I think in the 80s. They are today generally known as the Khoi and the San. It's a nomadic tribe or tribes who lived all over South Africa for tens of thousands of years from what we can discover. They especially lived in the more eastern parts, which is more rainy, more rainforestry and so forth. And we know that they lived in these areas, even though we don't associate them with these areas. Today we associate them with the desert, with the western part of South Africa, which is more dry. We know they lived in the eastern parts because you can see the cave paintings and you can see the traces of their heritage in these parts of the country. But they don't live there anymore because they were eventually pushed out by groups coming in from the north, which anthropologists say come more or less from where Cameroon is today. In other words, sort of Central Africa, actually Central Western Africa, then moving towards the east and then coming down sort of along the Great Lakes. That's the Victoria Lake, Tanganyika, Malawi, and so forth. And this migration happened largely as a result of conflict up north in Africa. Tribes warring, having wars with each other, pushing each other out. And then the groups that came down came by different names. In some, you could call them the Nguni tribes. Some people call them the Bantu speaking or the Bantu communities. But they were eventually sort of pushed down by wars happening north up in Africa, crossing the Limpopo River, which is today the northern border of South Africa. Back then, the borders didn't exist as we know them today. And they started settling in what we can today describe as South Africa. And of course, when they came here, they found the local indigenous community and there was friction, there was wars. And eventually they were stronger. They had more exposure to wars and conflict than the local communities had. And they eventually were able to push these smaller so-called Bushmen out of the areas where they lived into the more western sides of South Africa.
And this is very important. I saw you speaking to Jordan Peterson about this.
Yes.
About how this argument is often portrayed as black versus white. And I think he said something along the lines of, to portray it as white versus black is so disingenuous, it's practically a lie. There's actually more genetic variation within the black community than most Europeans.
Yes, absolutely. The black, so people in South Africa, politicians love to talk about, the white community and the black community. But you're absolutely right to say, just within what we know as South Africa, within the so-called black community, there is more diversity than there is in Western Europe among white peoples. In terms of cultural prevalences, in terms of religious practices, in terms of languages, in terms of the way in which they approach things like warfare, like culture, like heritage, traditions, and so forth. And I mean, you can write not just a book, you can write a series of books on conflict between black communities within South Africa. most well known today is probably the Zulus. But looking at the Zulus as an example, the conflict that the Zulu people have been engaged with over the years, with not just with the Afrikaners or with the English, but with other black groups in South Africa. It's a very long and a very rich history and a very interesting history, and one that has presented many heroes, many tragedies, big battles and so forth, and it's worth looking into. But yes, that's absolutely the case, that obviously there was friction between white people and black people in South Africa, and there was friction among white people in South Africa, the Anglo-Boer War being the most famous example. But it's very easy to underestimate the extent to which there was friction among black tribes in South Africa, and the extent to which there still is friction between these tribes. And politicians would like to tell us that that's not the case. They would like to tell us that, it's actually just white people and black people, because if they can convince, the population that that's the case, then that's easy. The black people, so-called as one big homogeneous whole, is the majority, and the white people are the minority, and you can win an election like that. But yes, as far as the Khoi and the San are concerned in South Africa, they've had some really tough times, and also when they eventually met with the Dutch and the Germans and the French coming, there were some well-known cases of cooperation, trading, and so forth, but there were also some wars, and so they were also pushed out to an extent by white people arriving in South Africa, and so they have a very sad story, and it's very good that community is still there, and their culture and their language should definitely be cherished.
What are the patterns of these indigenous groups and these groups that have come down from further north in Africa? Are they agricultural societies, agrarian societies, farming in one place, or are they nomadic? What's the kind of pattern of movement?
Yeah, so it was largely nomadic. Back then, South Africa didn't have cattle and chickens and all of these things that came from other continents. So it was largely nomadic and hunter-gatherers. A lot of them, especially the Bushmen or the Khoi and the San, a lot of them were hunter-gatherers. And they actually started settling more into what we know as conventional agriculture as a result of their interaction with Europeans, getting access to cattle and things like that. Of course, it's very useful to have cattle, and it makes life a lot easier if you have cattle. And so a lot of it was hunter-gatherers, and a lot of these groups were very much on the move. And so they came. It's difficult to pinpoint. It's impossible to pinpoint, like, in what year did these groups come into South Africa. It was a long time ago, hundreds of years ago. But it's a bit easier to pinpoint at which point did they eventually settle. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I know, the Tswana community, which is also more linked to Botswana, have settled where they are settled more in the Free State of South Africa quite some while ago, some hundreds of years ago. But especially the Xhosa people, of which Nelson Mandela famously came, and the Zulu people, which were sort of the two dominant groups that were engaged with by, you could say, the white settlers arriving in South Africa. They arrived where they eventually settled not long before the Europeans came. So it's simply factually inaccurate, historically inaccurate to present these groups as having been there where they were for hundreds of years and so forth before the interaction they had with white people. And that's the narrative about South Africa, but it's not factually correct. That's not to say that they weren't in Africa or they didn't cross the Limpopo River, but the truth was that it was a dynamic. Firstly, it was very sparsely populated, that there were different communities. It was dynamic in the sense that they were moving around, that they had wars with each other, chased each other off their land, occupied land, and so forth. And there were some settlement patterns that were happening, and that's more or less when the more well-known side of the story transpired, which is the Dutch arriving, them being joined by the Germans and the French, and eventually forming what became known as the Afrikaner community.
Well, tell me about that. What is the Afrikaner community?
So The Afrikaner community is a community that became a nation in South Africa. The easy way to tell the story is that the Afrikaners descend primarily from the Dutch, but then also from the Germans and the French. But the truth is that there were other influences as well, other smaller nations in Europe. We were very much influenced by the English through our interactions with the English, marrying with the English and so forth. Culturally, it's sort of a joke because we had this war against the British, but culturally speaking, we're probably much more English than we are Dutch today. But also the Afrikaner community was very much influenced by local tribes and tribes and communities they met and engaged with in Africa, such as the extent to which our language developed. Afrikaans is in some ways comparable with Dutch. Almost in a way you can say Dutch is comparable with German. So there are some Dutch words, many Dutch words that are the same more or less than Afrikaans words, but you can clearly see the language developed in a different way. And we have many Afrikaans words that there aren't words for in Dutch, or at least where our words are different, because we took these from Malayan influences and local influences. Like the word that we have for banana is pisang, which is a word that we got here. And we have many such words. Susati, which is our word for kebab. Baboti, which is a particular dish we have. The word baya, which means very much, it doesn't have European roots. It's a word that we developed here or got from other languages. And so the language and the community developed here. And the first time that we know of when the word Afrikaner was used to refer to a particular cultural community is actually a very interesting story and somewhat symbolic. It was in the year 1707. And the story was, it was in the town of Stellenbosch, which is the second oldest city in South Africa, at least cities as we know them today. And there was some time during the night when a group of young people or students probably had too much to drink, and they were running up and down in the town or in the streets of Stellenbosch, making a noise, disrupting the peace, as it was said. And they were then caught and arrested. And the magistrate, part of the legend is that he was beating them, or that he was calling on them for punishment, that they had to receive some form of a beating. And then this particular young man went by the name Hendrik Bibou. And Hendrik Bibou was threatened to be deported because he was apparently a problem to the community for making a noise and disrupting the peace. And the magistrate said to him, or threatened him at some point with deportation, saying that they're gonna send him to Jakarta or Indonesia, one of these places. To which he responded saying that I will not go, even if the magistrate beats me to death. I will stay here because I am an Afrikaner. And so we sort of laugh about that story because the first time this word was used, it was by someone who had too much to drink and who was disrupting the peace. But there's some symbolism in that. The person saying that my identity is here, you cannot just send me to another country because this is the place where I became who I am. And I don't think Hendrik Bibou, when he said that, necessarily had this big philosophical meaning that he attached to this statement. But there is some philosophical undertones to this, saying, do not deport me because I am an Afrikaner. So that's, and I think that's, you could say that the Afrikaner people were not quite a people or a nation by 1707 to the extent that we are today. But that was sort of the first traces. And I think another major development, or perhaps the biggest historical development to the Afrikaner people becoming what we eventually became, was the Great Track. And so the Great Track was started the idea in the early 1800s. Back then, our ancestors lived in the Cape, the southern part, western part of South Africa, where Cape Town is today, and the area around that. There were two major factors that led to the Great Track. So the Great Track, firstly, was the big move into the interior of South Africa, up north where Pretoria is, the capital city, the Free State, much of the big metropolitan areas that we know today. And there were two major things that sparked this. The one was wars on the Eastern Front, with especially the Xhosa people, where as the settlement expanded, they eventually met at the Fish River. They met the Xhosa people. And the other was the colonization of the Cape by the British. And that's important because that was at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. It was after the French Revolution. And because of the wars with Napoleon, the British was expanding the British Empire, and they identified the Cape as sort of an important strategic point.
And for someone that's watching that doesn't know anything about South Africa, like I didn't 3 weeks ago before I came here.
Yep.
Why is the Cape so important strategically?
Okay, that's an important one. So back then we didn't have the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal didn't exist. So there was a variety of many very important reasons. The most important reason initially was the fact that in order to get to the east to trade with India, Indonesia, and so forth, and later Australia and so forth, you needed to travel around Africa. You couldn't go through the Suez Canal, and that was a very long travel, a very long trip by boat or by ship. And so the strategic importance of controlling the southern tip of Africa was that you controlled the refreshment station. And it was more than just a refreshment station. I've heard some historians express concern about people calling it a refreshment station. It was that. In other words, ships stopping for fresh supplies. Back then it was easy to get sick if you didn't have proper water, fruits and so forth, nutrition. But it was not just that. It was also a place where they built ships, where they repaired ships that was damaged during storms, got new ships and so forth. So there was an economy on the southern tip of Africa, again, where Cape Town is. And controlling that was sort of the portal to the east, to the Eastern world. And so that was very important. Another reason that came later in the run-up to the Anglo-Boer War was the discovery of gold and diamonds and platinum. So if South Africa wasn't important as a result of the traveling around the southern tip of Africa, it became very important because of the mineral resources. But back then, that wasn't discovered yet. So England had its famous war with Napoleon. Well, the whole of Europe had a war with Napoleon, and it was around this time that the English then came and took control of the Cape, and there was some internal friction at the time and attempts to sort of find some form of a reconciliation between. They were called the Dutch in the Cape, but it wasn't just Dutch because, as I mentioned, there was a lot of French Huguenots coming, a lot of Germans, there was some Hungarians and other communities coming, Irish and so forth. So it wasn't just the Dutch, but that was sort of the collective term that was used for the people living in South Africa. But these two realities, the wars on the Eastern Front, which is sort of the Eastern Cape today, and the conflict with the English eventually sparked. But then what also happened was the whole debate about slavery, which became sort of intertwined. That was at the time of the abolition of slavery. And so a lot of people have said that the great track into South Africa happened because those groups who lived in the southern tip of Africa, or the Afrikaners, the proto-Afrikaners, were against the abolition of slavery. And so they protested that, and so they wanted to move into the interior to get slaves. But that's historically not accurate. If you read their own manifestos, they wrote, "We reject slavery. We're going into Africa not because of the slavery debate, but because we want to have a place for our community, and we want to have peaceful relations with whichever communities we encounter."
Where does that misconception come from?
I think it's because there was slavery in the Cape, and it's an important point. The slavery in the Cape was not, contrary to popular belief, Europeans arriving and enslaving the local community. It was purchasing slaves and importing slaves from other parts of the world, like Malaysia and other parts of Africa. So there was a slave trade, as there was everywhere in the world. And this, again, it was at the time of the abolition of slavery and when slavery was abolished. And while this abolition was happening, this particular group said, we're going to move into the interior. But there was some friction. Obviously, there was resistance to the abolition of slavery as well. And so the fact that slavery was abolished, there was resistance. A lot of people agreed with it and some people resisted. So it was abolished, there was resistance, and then a group moved into the interior. And then the conclusion is, oh, okay, they disagreed with the slavery thing. When it was more the wars on the Eastern Front and the colonization of the Cape that led to this. And they didn't go and establish a slave trade in sort of the interior of South Africa. And so that sort of sparked the Great Trek. And I don't know if this is an exaggeration, but the word trek is an Afrikaans word. It means move. And the story I've heard was that if it wasn't for the Great Trek, we wouldn't have had Star Trek, because the word trek sort of became popularized by this big event, which became known as the Great Trek. And so trek became a word that became sort of known over the world for moving in large numbers to a particular place. Maybe that's an exaggeration. That's at least what we tell ourselves. But the Great Trek, I think, was one of the major events that shaped the Afrikaner people into becoming a unique nation with a unique history. And because during the Great Trek, there were a lot of, there were sort of two parallel stories. The one was literally dozens of treaties that were signed with local communities in terms of cooperation, trading, and so forth. And on the other side, wars, like really brutal battles that led to a lot of deaths on the Afrikaner side, but also in terms of the Zulus, the as they were known as the Matabeles, local communities and so forth. And today, looking back historically, people only remember the conflict. They don't remember the cooperation. And so they say South Africa has a long history of violence, which in a certain sense is true, but it's true for Europe as well. It's true for every country in the world.
Yeah.
But South Africa also has a long history of cooperation between communities. And it's unfortunate that people don't recognize that in the way in which we think about the history of South Africa today. But I think, to get to your point, this event, the people moving into the interior of South Africa, eventually establishing their own republics, which became known as the Boer republics. I think that was sort of the defining moment which created the Afrikaner people, when it was very clear that these people speak their own language. They are Christians, but they have their unique approach to religion. They speak their own language. They have their own culture. They have their own songs. They have their own cultural traditions and so forth. And this is a unique people that became a people in Africa.
Well, I think the pivotal part in all of this is the Battle of Blood River. And I'd love to hear from you about that. And for anyone at home that has a TikTok brain like me, with an attention span of about 3 seconds, I think this is a very interesting part of history, and there are loads of intricacies we can get into.
Yeah, so the Battle of Blood River was, I think, maybe the big defining moment. And so there's an interesting academic debate, you could say, or intellectual debate, which is, when did the Afrikaner people become the Afrikaner people? And there's not an easy answer. One answer could be in 1707, when Hendrik Piebou said, "I am an Afrikaner." Another answer could be when we decided to move into the interior of South Africa. I would say the most significant event was 16 December 1838, which was the Battle of Blood River. And the Battle of Blood River has become a massive legendary event and a cultural phenomenon up to today, where people still celebrate that battle every year, and on the 16th of December. But there's a bit of a misconception when people think about the commemoration of the Battle of Blood River, especially people who aren't Afrikaners. They would say, oh, these people commemorate this battle where they killed a lot of people, when that's not what the commemoration is. The commemoration is about the vow that was made in 1838. So the run-up to the Battle of Blood River is fascinating. It's a great track, and the different leaders, there were different track or groups that moved into the interior. They had sort of an alliance, but you could say different families with bigger communities moving in different groups. And they each had a leader, and these leaders there was some sense of solidarity, but they also had some quarrels and disagreements. And the big disagreement was, what is the destination? And the famous debate there was, is the destination the eastern side of South Africa, which is today KwaZulu-Natal, or is it more the north, which is today Transvaal? So is it where Durban is, or is it where Pretoria is, you could say? And Piet Retief was one of the big leaders, actually the most famous leader of the Great Trek, even at the time, today as well. for historical reasons, but at the time he was sort of the big authority figure. He wrote the manifesto in which he rejected slavery and so forth. And his argument was, we need to move to the eastern part of South Africa, which of course wasn't known as South Africa back then. But we need to move there, and for a few reasons. One, it's very fertile land. It's where KwaZulu-Natal is today, where Durban is, you could say. And also we'll be able to have a port. It's by the sea, so we can build a port and we can trade with other countries and we can build ships and so forth. The argument against that was that was where the Zulus lived, and the Zulus were the biggest, strongest, you could say, military force in Africa, as a result of the leadership of King Shaka Zulu, who famously developed what we call in Afrikaans steekspies. It's like a short spear that they used in battle, and he had these military tactics that he developed, and he really made the Zulus a fighting force to reckon with.
Well, I've just been to the Battle of Isandlwana, where the British got absolutely pounded and destroyed, decimated by this Zulu formation using the horns of the buffalo, their famous technique of surrounding their enemy and killing them. And they were a formidable fighting force. People often look at that battle as British loss, but really it was a Zulu victory. Just masterful planning. And they had this warrior culture built up. I found it fascinating learning about the washing of the spears that they had, where these young soldiers weren't allowed to marry until they had come back with blood on their spears from killing an enemy.
Yeah.
And it's a great incentive that for young, horny men wanting to marry, wanting to have kids, go and kill an enemy.
You need to prove yourself on the battlefield.
Yeah, that creates a pretty formidable force.
Yes. So there were a few, you could say, developments or incentives that especially King Shaka implemented, which is why he became this legendary figure. That is one of them. One is also the practicing with the bare feet. They had to run through thorns and rocky, sharp rocks and so forth, constantly, and practice. And he really had his soldiers go out and practice, not just fight when necessary, but practice to prepare for war. The other was he changed the way they built their shields, so they made their shields much bigger. He also, back then, the spears was primarily used for throwing, and he said the problem with that is you throw away your weapon.
Yeah.
So he made the spears shorter, and he made the blades much bigger, so that you can hold it in your hand and you can stab the enemy, and you can still have the spear in your hand.
The assegai, right?
The assegai, yes, that's what it became known as. Yes.
And didn't they name that after the sound it makes when you push it into a body and then pull it out? I think
that I've heard that. Yes, I'm not sure if that's true, but I have heard people say that. Yes, and then they had these tactics that Shaka especially developed about how to attack another, the enemy. And what the famous bullhorns was you run up with your spears. Firstly, you try to get them to throw their spears at you, and then you block them with your shield because you have bigger shields. So the more spears they can throw at you, the better, because then they have fewer weapons left. And then the idea was to run up to the enemy in a particular formation, and when you get to them, split up, which is very much what the Romans did, and the Greeks and so forth, is try to encircle the enemy, and they would then encircle them with their shields, create this sort of shield wall around the enemy. And once they have encircled them, they can use their spears and stab them through the shield wall and sort of move in until everyone was killed. And they had massive, very bloody victories as a result of that.
So this is a strong force. They're highly trained. There's tens of thousands of them, if not hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
They also were ultra marathon runners in the day. They would literally march and run marathons in a day to get to certain strategic advantage points and then beat their enemies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Surely the Afrikaners can't trek into Zululand.
Well, exactly. So today we can say that it's so obvious that they shouldn't have tried it. So strategically, from a strategic perspective, what do you achieve by trying to find some form of a homeland in the heart of the strongest military power in Africa, and just thinking that it's going to work out well? And so that was the debate that they had, and Piet Retief was very much committed to these two things. There were probably more, but at least the idea that there's very fertile ground or land, we'll be able to farm, we'll be able to have a proper nation that we can set up there. That's the one. And the other was the idea that we'll be able to build a port and the disadvantages of not having a port. And so there was this debate. The other leader that famously disagreed with him was Gerrit Maritz, who was one of the other great leaders of the Great Track. And Retief then said, well, let's not all just move in. Let's go and negotiate and speak with them and see what we can do. And by then there were translators, they had the ability to communicate and so forth. And so he went in, he had a meeting with King Dingaan, who was the brother of King Shaka. Dingaan became king by killing Shaka. So Shaka was this legendary Zulu king who was sort of stabbed in the back, you could say, by his brother, who then took the throne. And so they eventually had negotiations and they struck some form of a deal. And the deal was that there was a different tribe led by a king or a tribal leader called Sikonyela. And he had stolen cattle from the Zulus. And so the Zulu king Dingaan said, if you go and retrieve my cattle from Sikonyela, then I will give you this piece of land where you can stay. And it was an identifiable piece of land. It was between, I think, the Tugela River and the Umzimvubu River. So it was two rivers. He said, the land between those two rivers will be yours. Retief was very happy about that. He went back to his people. He said, we have a deal. We need to get the cattle and then we'll have a piece of land where we can settle and we can build a town and so forth. They got the cattle. They took the cattle back to the Zulu king and then they stayed there. They went with a you could say a commando, sort of a proto-commando, like a group of men. Retief's own son famously joined them on that mission. And they signed a treaty there. So it was a document. Of course, the Zulu king didn't have a concept of a contract, sort of from a Western perspective, but there was a contract, and he then sort of made a cross on the contract. And they then had this agreement, and the king said, well, you should stay this night, you should stay this evening, and we'll have a celebration. And the story is then that they had this celebration with the Zulu king, and at some point, he screamed the words Bulalani Abatakati. That's Zulu for kill the wizards. And they then, before going into the lager, they had to leave their weapons outside. So they weren't armed. I think there were about 60 men. They were then taken out. There was a nearby hill, which was called Kwamatiwani. And that means murder hill. That's where they went to do executions.
Tastefully named.
Yes. And so they went to this murder hill. They took the whole group there and they slaughtered them. So they slaughtered all the Afrikaners, or they were called voortrekkers at the time, the people engaging in the Great Track. And Retief, who as the leader famously had to wait. The story is that they held him up and he had to watch as his whole group was slaughtered, including his son. And once everyone was dead, they then killed him. They left the bodies there, and several months later, his family eventually came and found his body, and they were able to identify him based on his saddlebag and his clothing. And within the bag, the treaty was still there that was signed. But this was still the run-up to the big battle. So when they were killed, the Zulu king Dingaan then gave orders for they were called impies, which means soldiers, to go out and slaughter the lagers, the voortrekker lagers, or the camps at night, who were camped out at where Blaukrans is today. There's a famous bungee jumping bridge at that area. And Vienen, the town today, is called Vienen, which means sorrow or weeping. I think that's what it means. It's named that as a result of these developments. And so they then came out in the middle of the night. It was largely women and children and elderly people. And I think the amount of people they killed was about 185, mostly women and children slaughtered during the night. And so the next day, when the voortrekkers or the Afrikaners sort of tried to figure out what was happening, they just saw that they were butchered and massacred. And so this led to a lot of friction internally, and they didn't know what to do. Eventually, they elected a new leader, whose name was Andries Pretorius. The name of the city, Pretoria, today was named after his son. So his son was the person after whom Pretoria, the capital city, was eventually named. Pretorius then developed or initiated a punishment commando, you could say, a commando of about 300 to 400 people to say, we're going to counterattack them to get them back for what they did to us. And they, my great-great-grandfather was part of that group, and he was the religious leader. So, and his name was Sarel Celia, and so he was sort of the pastor, you could say, or the preacher in the group. And they then wanted to do sort of a strategic or a tactical counterattack. There weren't a lot of men; there were a few hundred, but they were then surrounded at one point. They found that the whole of, as they called it, the whole of Zululand surrounded them. And Sarel Celia, this religious leader, said, we need to write a vow to God because we're surrounded. We're about 300 and we're surrounded by about 12,000 people. And they're going to slaughter us. And so they wrote this vow. And the vow basically said that if God protects us in this battle, if we survive the battle, if we emerge victorious, we will build a church for him. We will give the honor of the victory to God. We wouldn't take the honor of the victory for ourselves. And we will commemorate this day every day from now on as a Sabbath. And we will encourage our children to participate in this with us. That's basically what the vow said. And so this battle happened then on the 16th. They made the vow, I think, the week before when they knew the battle was coming. And they made it every day up to the 16th. On the 16th of December, that the morning, that was when they were eventually attacked. And so it was on they had the wagons into a lager. It was on the corner of the Buffalo River. And eventually the battle was called the Battle of Blood River because so much blood was spilled that the river turned red. And it was a very big battle. It took the entire day. But by the end of that day, there were about 3,000 Zulus who were killed, and not one of the Afrikaner people were killed in that battle. So it was a very spectacular thing. There were a few people who were injured in the battle, one of them being Pretorius himself. He was stabbed in the hand with an assegai after the battle, actually. And this was something that they didn't foresee. They thought this is our final moment. And they eventually survived, and the fact that they survived with 0 casualties and inflicted 3,000 casualties was something that really shaped the Afrikaner people. I mean, even if you're not religious, even if you think history is a sham or whatever, that event had such a big impact on the psyche of the Afrikaner people, from a cultural perspective, from a historical perspective, and a religious perspective. And I do believe that's one of the reasons why the Afrikaner people today are still very religious compared to Europe, I know many Americans are very religious, but other parts of the world, other Westerners tend not to be as religious as the Afrikaner people.
Well, let's dig into that a bit deeper, because I think that's a really interesting point about the impact on their psyche and essentially this belief that God has protected them and they won this battle with 0 injuries or 0 casualties at least for a reason.
Yes.
Absolutely. How does that play out the next 100, 200 years?
Yeah, well, that has had a very significant impact, and to such an extent that this is something that was famously used by political movements, Afrikaner, you could say nationalist movements, saying we are, if not the chosen people, we are a chosen people because God chose us. We are here for a reason. And so I think a lot of people have, in a certain sense, abused that for political reasons, not necessarily to our benefit in the long run. But the idea that we are here for a reason was very much entrenched in the way the Afrikaner people thought.
And you can totally see how that can come about. It reminds me of the more modern case of the Donald Trump assassination attempt. I'm not religious. I'm very much atheist-leaning agnostic. But the way he turned as he got shot at and dodged this bullet, having it actually clip his ear and avoid his skull.
Yes.
You have to look at that and be like, okay, if there was ever a sign that there's some sort of greater thing out there, this is it. So, you know, you can totally get how after that he would come out and be more religious and think that he's been chosen by God to go on this mission, even if I don't necessarily think that that's true. You can really understand how that would play into people's minds.
And how people interpreted that event as a sign of, divine intervention.
And we have to remember as well, this isn't in 2025.
Yes, exactly. This was 1838. So that was the time when this happened. And so afterwards, interestingly enough, the King Dingaan was eventually defeated partly by his other brother, King Mpande, who was assisted then by the Voortrekker. So they had a treaty, and eventually he became the Zulu king, and he was a much more reconciliatory figure, you could say. But so this big event was sort of one of the final developments before the establishment of the Boer republics. So after this, the Afrikaners established a variety of republics, one of them being the Republic of Natal, which was eventually also colonized, which became British again. And then there were many republics, but the two famous ones were the Transvaal Republic, or it was also called the South African Republic, and the Free State Republic. So the Transvaal is the northern part of South Africa, and the Free State is, the Bloemfontein, more central South Africa. And this was then established, and it was at this time, during the establishment of these republics, when a very important development happened, and that was firstly the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley area, which is the capital of the Northern Cape today, and then not long after that, the discovery of gold in the Johannesburg area, which made South Africa an international focus point when the world started, and especially the British, started to take note of the fact that, okay, this place is not just a strategic point, geographically speaking, in terms of traveling around Africa, but it's very rich in natural resources. And that then, of course, led to the Anglo-Boer War.
To weave into this story, I think it's important to speak about this ownership of land and sort of maybe the more almost philosophical concept of land ownership.
Yeah, yes.
It's such a difficult nut to crack, and you see this playing out in the Middle East too, with Israel and Gaza and everything going on there. It's this constant conflict, and I went early in the year actually to the Holy Land, as people call it. Yeah, and I did a whole guided tour with a family friend around the old city of Jerusalem, and he was pointing out, okay, so here is where the Jewish people invaded to get the place back, and here's where the Muslims invaded to get it back, and then here's where the Jews, and here's where the Muslims, and like it's all wrapped up, and here where the Christians came in. It's so complex, and there are so many different layers to all of that. And the way I see it, the foundations of all of these arguments on this more abstract concept of ownership and when something is actually yours, especially property and land. What's going on in South Africa once the gold's been discovered, once the Afrikaners are an actual people and they're established, linking to their ownership of that place that they've essentially fought battles to win, right?
Yes, so that is one of the most important underlying questions is how do we make sense of the notion of ownership or property rights, you could say, from a more modern perspective. And what South Africa clearly shows, as do other places in the world, but South Africa especially, is that there are different conceptions of ownership, and there are certainly different views as to what constitutes ownership, or when do you become the owner of something. And in the Western tradition, we have developed almost a canon in terms of how we think about ownership, and the notion of taking control of something, if it's in legal terms a res nullius, in other words, something that doesn't belong to anyone, and you start taking control of this, it becomes yours. And it's been written about, there's a lot of philosophy about that. John Locke famously wrote about the idea of a fruit hanging on a tree and the action of actually plucking that fruit from the tree. That's the process through which it becomes your property, and all of this. And in terms of property rights, as we know it today, of owning a piece of land, the basic idea, at least the Western idea, is it's if no one lives there, or if you cannot establish that it belongs to anyone, and you start, taking ownership of that, it it becomes your property. Now that's sort of the old way, because today they are not uncharted territories and so forth. But the counter argument to that is, but what if someone's great grandfather had crossed that mountain several decades ago? That person was there before you, so doesn't that mean that that person was the owner? And then the debate becomes, but if you walked over a mountain, does it mean that it's your mountain? Or does it become your mountain when you actually build something on that mountain? And it turns out that you can have that debate, but it becomes more complicated when there's civilizational differences, when there's what you could say an African view as opposed to a Western view, and we've seen that in South Africa.
What's the difference?
So the Western view today is very much linked to the idea of private property rights. It's very much contractual. It's yours, like the story of Piet Retief. It's yours if you actually bought it. If there was some negotiation and there was a treaty that was signed. Or if no one was there, we couldn't identify anyone whose land it was, and we settled there and we started developing property. So it's sort of a more procedural thing. And if you go through the process of acquiring the land, then it becomes your property. The African, and I cannot be a spokesperson for the African view because I wouldn't explain it properly, but it's more a communal approach. It's more something that has to do with ancestral rights to being there. It more has to do with having been there before, and also, and some people joke about this today. The former South African president said, we must remember corruption is a Western thing. And what he meant by that was that the crime of corruption is a Western thing. And he then went further by explaining that. He actually said, but in our tradition, if someone does you a favor, you thank them for that. And now today we hear that that's corruption. And people sort of joke about that, but it's important to think about the concept of property rights as well, because the counter argument to the Dungan-Retief Treaty was that was a malicious attempt to get property from the Zulu king, so therefore that treaty doesn't count. It's not applicable to us, or you cannot enforce it, because they were trying to sort of trick us into losing our land, into taking our land. And so it becomes on a cultural level, an issue that isn't really, it's not easy to settle. And even today, and I think it's another reason why South Africa is important for the West to look at, is even today there are different concepts of property rights and how to deal with that. And within the Zulu community, for example, today, there's a much stronger emphasis on the idea of communal ownership of land. The idea that the land belongs to the king in what is today the Ingonyama Trust, where the Zulu kingdom is. The king is the owner of the land, or the royal family owns the land. And you can do stuff on the land, but it belongs to the community, not to you. That's very strange from a Western perspective. The Western perspective is you buy the land, you have property ownership, you have, you can prove contractually, or you have a deed to the land. And from a Western perspective, you can then easily say, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't do it like that. If you should have a modern economy, you should have private property. But that's also, it's not that simple to just go to some community and say your cultural preference is wrong. You should abandon your own cultural preference and adopt ours. And I think that's a lot of the dark side of Western imperialism that we know today was as a result of Westerners trying to think, or trying to enforce their way of thinking onto other communities, saying, you should do things the way we do things. And if you don't do it the way we do it, then you are wrong and we are sort of superior. And it becomes tricky, because at least my perspective, and I think the Western perspective, is you need private property as a basis for a modern economy. But also you need to have some form of a respect for different cultural dynamics and say, we're not going to try to enforce our way of thinking onto you. And these type of cultural and communal dynamics leads to friction. And it goes back to the point we started this interview on, is that there are different ways of thinking about realities and things in South Africa. And it's not that easy to deal with that by finding these easy solutions, or sort of writing a solution into a constitution and then accepting that things are going to work out fine without friction.
Well, I think this is a good time to jump ahead a little bit in the story, if we're going to call it that. And that's to the modern day, with expropriation without compensation.
Mm.
What is that? We've kind of laid the groundwork of the situation, the makeup of South Africa. These Boers go on with the British to become very rich from the gold, right?
Yeah.
And that comes with land ownership and the rest of it. Now we've got expropriation without compensation. How does that tie back to this period? What is it? How is it relevant?
So let's say we had the Anglo-Boer War. We actually had two Anglo-Boer Wars, but the second one was the well-known one from 1899 to 1902, which eventually ended with a treaty that was signed, but it was a British victory. And there were many consequences of that, but the big macro political consequence was South Africa became a union. And the difference was before the war, before 1910, technically, South Africa was a variety of Boer republics, kingdoms, colonies, different communities governing themselves in different ways in what was, broadly speaking, the territory of South Africa as we know it today. And after the war, this was all put together into one big territory, which became the Union of South Africa. And so the borders of South Africa that we know today became the borders in 1910.
Right.
As a result of the Anglo-Boer War. And back then, there was some degree of self-governance given to South Africa, to whites in South Africa, but it was still under the British Crown, so we were a colony. And we were known as the Union of South Africa, with its own parliament that sort of reported to England, to the king. But from a land ownership perspective, that was one major development, 1910, the unionization of South Africa, which, by the way, the ANC, which is governing South Africa today, if you read their founding documents and their founding papers, they would say that they were founded in response to the unionization of South Africa, because they thought that, they regard that as an atrocity, having the different communities governing themselves added together as one big whole, which is ironic because today they want to maintain that whole. They want that collective in place. But they were actually a protest movement against this. The other big development was 1913 with the Natives Land Act, a piece of legislation that was implemented. Now, that is probably the most, if not one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in South Africa's history. And it's also, to an extent, I don't want to say misunderstood piece of legislation, but how do we put it? It's a piece of legislation that people do not necessarily comprehend the context. And I'm not saying context in a way of trying to defend it, in terms of the reality in South Africa at the time. Why do I say that? Because that piece of legislation famously said that, I believe, 12%, or that's at least the consequence of that act, 12% of the surface area of South Africa was designated to black communities. And so that is today interpreted as saying that black people was pushed into 12%, from 100% of the surface into 12% of South Africa's surface, and that's where they had to live. It was a bit more complicated than that, because South Africa was not densely populated at the time. And there was a commission, and I mention this because I think historically it's important, and because people don't know this today. Yeah. There was a commission at the time called the Beaumont Commission, that investigated patterns of land ownership or settlement patterns in South Africa. And if I recall correctly, what that commission found, if the question is black land ownership, because that's, looking back today, what the big contentious issue was or became, that commission found, I believe, that black people in South Africa occupied about 9% of the surface. They sort of plotted the land and they said, this is where the black people live. Then this Natives Land Act then said, well, we're going to designate certain reserves for them where they can live. And that was, I believe, 12%. So it's still 12% out of 100 is very little. But what is incorrect, it is incorrect to say that black people, as we know South Africa today, occupied the whole surface area and they were then pushed into these little areas. There were other problems with that act. The fact that it it designated living areas according to race. I think that's the underlying problem. But so the Natives Land Act is regarded today as the big land injustice. That's the big thing that needs to be corrected. And so the argument is that was an injustice, that piece of legislation, and in many ways it was. In me trying to give context to that piece of legislation is not trying to defend it, it's just trying to explain it for what it was. And so the argument is we need to correct that. What is a problem, however, today is that these land activists do not seem to be able to differentiate or distinguish between the idea of restitution and the idea of redistribution, which is fundamentally different. It could be the same thing, but the definition is very different. So restitution says you need to correct an injustice. There was something that happened that was wrong. There was a wrongdoing and we need to fix that. And I think any reasonable person should support that. If there was a wrongdoing, if there was a community that was chased off their land, then they should get their land back. I think that as a matter of principle. Redistribution is something else. And the way at least what redistribution means today is it just means look at whoever is the owner of a piece of land. If the person who owns the land is white, that is a problem. If the person who owns the land is black, that's a good thing. But that doesn't recognize that you can be the owner of a piece of land and be a white person and have acquired that piece of land through legitimate means. So what makes it complicated today is there were land injustices. There were injustices in terms of how patterns of land ownership developed. And there were certainly black communities that were dispossessed of their land. That's undoubtedly the case. That then is interpreted today as every black person that lives in South Africa was dispossessed, and every white person that lives in South Africa was involved with these dispossessions. And so every white person that owns land, there should be a question mark upon that person, or that ownership is illegitimate. And every black person that doesn't own land, that's because some white person took your land. And it's more complicated than that. But the problem is, dealing with history through political solutions is very difficult because you lose nuance, and the problem or the issue becomes narrowed down to a question of populism, and whichever politician is able to be the most populist, to scream the loudest, to be the most controversial in presenting the argument, eventually wins the argument. Not necessarily because they win on the facts, but because they win on the politics of the argument. And that's because, and I think this has led to a place where the whole debate about land ownership has become so warped in South Africa that it's very difficult to sort of find your way through and sort of come out on the other side and still be sane.
Local, provincial and national authorities will use this legislation to expropriate land in the public interest for varied reasons that seek to, amongst others, promote inclusivity and access to natural resources. That's from the South African Parliament website.
Yes.
Where is the line? When is it too much? You're trying too hard to fix things that happened 200 years ago. And when is it just? You said that any reasonable person would actually agree with these measures, but it's just harder in reality to actually practically implement these things. How do we navigate this? And is it always wrong to expropriate land without compensation?
Well, firstly, I think any reasonable person should agree that there were injustices in South Africa as far as land is concerned. There were also white people who were dispossessed, but if the issue is ownership of land by black people, it certainly did happen, that communities were dispossessed. And any reasonable person should then agree that where that happened, it has to be corrected. There has to be either compensation in the form of money, because a lot of these people have said actually that they would rather want money as compensation than actually getting the land. Or they should get the land, or there should be some form of a correction. But again, it's difficult to correct things that happened in the past by implementing policies today. I think reasonable people should agree with that. It becomes, but I also think reasonable people should be willing to take a stance against the idea that the race of the owner of the land, by definition, declares whether that ownership is legitimate or not. And that is really literally what politicians in South Africa in the ruling party and other radical or leftist parties want to do. They would explicitly argue this, that your race determines whether your ownership is legitimate. And so the question then is, how do we deal with things like these? How do we deal with this in correcting historic injustices in a way that moves us forward? I'm not sure if there's a very clear answer. And I am very much guided or influenced by Thomas Sowell's thinking on this, who has said, in a certain sense, it's not good news, because his conclusion is that he hasn't been able to find a single example anywhere in the world of a community that moved from poverty to affluence as a result of political interventions, so policy interventions. And his conclusion is the only way to move from poverty to affluence is, he calls it a combination of three things. It's training or skills development, combined with savings, combined with hard work or work ethic. You cannot move from poverty to affluence if you don't have training and skills development, if you don't have a culture of savings, and if you don't have proper work ethic. Now, a lot of people in South Africa work really hard. So I'm not saying that people are lazy. Some people are, but a lot of people work really hard, but they are still very poor. And I think that's why part of the working hard alone is not the solution. Part of the solution is having a proper, well-functioning education system where you can work hard, and as a result of your hard work, you actually become better at what you do, and your skills become improved. And then the third part, according to Thomas Sowell, is then a culture of saving, not just when you get money, spend it on an expensive car or expensive handbag or purse or something. And it makes sense to say you need the combination of these three things. But the problem is, none of these three things are a priority for those in power. What's a priority for them is political scapegoating, using minorities as a punching bag, trying to implement socialist policies that not only doesn't it focus on any of these three things, it actively disadvantages these three things. It's bad for the education system. It disincentivizes hard work because you get social grants from the government. And when you actually go out and get a job, you lose your social grants. So why would you want to start working? So the policies that they are implementing actively undermines the solution. And that's the problem. And then the solution that they would then present as the solution is, we need to have redistribution of property. We need to have more Marxism and more Leninism, and that's somehow going to work. And they actively argue that even though they would concede that these policies have failed, there are few people in power today in South Africa who would say these policies that they've been implementing for the last 30 years are a success. They would say it's a failure because it hasn't been implemented aggressively enough. So the half-baked policy led to a half-baked failure. And now if we implement it more aggressively, it's not going to lead to a more aggressive failure. It's going to lead to somehow to a success.
Real communism has never been tried.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly what they would argue. And they would say things like, they would even go as far as to say that, the Soviet Union actually had a good idea, or they just didn't apply it properly, or Mao Zedong had some good ideas in China. We need to do what Mao did, but we're going to do it properly, and this time it's going to work. Or they would go to Zimbabwe and say, we need to implement the policies of Robert Mugabe, but don't be alarmed, we're going to do it without violence, as if people are not going to resist when you take their property. And so it's as if it's really bizarre, these political movements that have adopted to socialism as the solution, how they aren't possible to expand their frame of reference beyond socialism, even up to today in the year 2025. They cannot think beyond the solutions of Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, the Soviet Union, communist China as the solution. They cannot comprehend that a free market and long-term investment in the economy is the way forward. They instinctively argue, and they still do, and those in power today in government in South Africa would instinctively continue to argue that that the free market somehow undermines freedom, and property rights is somehow something that should be, we should be antagonistic towards that. And if there's a problem with the economy in Zimbabwe, it's somehow America's fault. It's not the fault of their land reform policies. And I think, unfortunately, there is this movement in the world among certain communities, certain nations that still would like to believe in socialism, that sort of reinforce each other. It's like a communist echo chamber. And this alliance of very radical leftist movements internationally that keep telling each other that, we just need to implement communism. It's going to lead to a solution, when it hasn't ever. And there's no indication that it will make things better.
There's a lot to unpack there. And something that piques my interest is the talk of explicitly all white people who have ownership of property being bad, and expropriation needing to be done, and that land being given to the black people who have been oppressed. I guess in lieu of something like a Zania critical theory.
That's it, yes.
Could you steelman the argument from the government? How do they get away with that blatant discrimination? And also, I think it'll be useful to hear some of the things they've been saying that back up your statement that they are discriminating specifically against white people, and that all white landowners are bad.
Yep. So you want the steelman argument as to why we need more land reform in South Africa?
Yes.
So the argument, if I would try to make the argument as best as I could, the argument would be that descendants from Europe, people who are descendants of Europe, came to South Africa in 1652. The argument would be that there was peace and tranquility in Africa, which definitely wasn't the case. But you could at least say that, African nations were dealing with each other, and then the white people arrived. And there were certainly friction between communities in South Africa that you could draw along a racial division. You can certainly say that there was white versus black violence in South Africa. You can certainly make the point then that in as far as we had, for example, the Anglo-Boer War, it was a war between the Afrikaners and the British for control over South Africa, where local African communities were largely spectators. They participated on both sides of the war, but they were largely spectators to this war between these two European powers, you could say. You could then go further by saying that after the war, the unionization of South Africa was an important point where local communities living within South Africa lost a large degree of their own self-determination. You couldn't govern yourself anymore, at least not to the extent that you were able to before the war, because South Africa became one big collective whole, which was under British control. And then in terms of the 1913 Act, it certainly was the case that certain areas were designated to people on a racial basis. And that as a result of an attempt to implement that, white people who lived in black areas, so that were designated as black areas, and black people who lived in white areas were told to move. So it was not actually just black people who had to move, white people also had to, or they had to change their addresses, and there was a long history regarding that. There were certainly also cases where black communities had lost their land. Where there were certainly atrocities happening on African soil, where communities were chased off their lands, where communities were slaughtered, and so forth. And so I don't think it's possible to deny that there were some serious injustices that happened in South Africa. And now, what added to that, what we see today is that, generally speaking, and this is an exaggeration, but at least that's a broad observation, white people are wealthy and black people are poor in South Africa. Now, there are very wealthy black people and there are very poor white people, but that's at least what you see when you walk around in South Africa, at least. And so these things are combined then to say, well, you have these wealthy white people and these poor black people who live in townships. We have this history of land injustices, and we need this history as, in a way, defined people. And now we need to deal with this in some way. And And then that gets you to a point where you say, we need land reform. There needs to be some policy of land reform. And so I think that's the steelman argument in favor of land reform. And a lot of that is true. The question then is just, how do you deal with this in a way that actually moves the country forward, as opposed to one that leads to more friction and more racism and so forth?
Well, if you play the tape forward, what happens once that land's been expropriated and you live in this utopia, or so you think? Surely there are going to be a lot of pissed off people that are one day going to have the claim to take that land back again that was theirs and was theirs the whole time that they'd been alive. They had nothing to do with what happened generations ago.
Well, it's starting to happen now in South Africa with a younger generation of Afrikaners, for example, growing up in their 20s, who do not have the political baggage of the 1980s and the 1990s. They are very annoyed by the fact that they are treated as perpetrators when they didn't do anything wrong. And so what really, for me, it's not just a metaphor, it's an anecdote that really summarizes the problem with the land debate in South Africa, is a land reform summit that I attended in 2018. And the spokesperson for the Department of Land Reform spoke at this summit, and he gave this speech along the lines of what I just did when I steelmanned the argument about historic injustices and white people are wealthy and black people are poor and we need land reform and so forth. But he kept conflating, again, the idea of restitution and redistribution. So he would talk about addressing historic injustices, but then he would conflate that with, we need to take land that belongs to white people. As if you are white and you own land, it's because of an injustice by definition. And so he spoke about correcting historic injustices through redistribution on a racial basis. And then after his speech, I asked him a question and I said, here's a hypothetical situation and I want to know, what is the government's position on this? And so the situation is, there's a piece of land that is owned by a white farmer. And because of historical injustices, that has to be corrected. And so the government takes that land from that farmer, chases the farmer off the land, and then gives that piece of land to a black person to become a farmer, to farm on this property. So in other words, the historic injustice has now been corrected. What happens then if that black farmer decides 2 years down the line that he doesn't want to be a farmer anymore, and he wants to sell his property? He puts it in the market and the purchaser is white. And then 2 years down the line, a white guy buys the land from this black farmer. What's the government's position on this? Is this an injustice or not? Because the owner of the land is white. And his words were actually shocking. His words were, in that case, the correction of the injustice has been reversed. So in other words, the fact that the new person that owns the land is white, by definition, means we need to intervene again, regardless of the fact that he bought the land through perfectly legitimate means. And so that's the problem here, is it has become, so it's Marxist and it's communist, but it has become very much intertwined with, some people call it Fanonianism, but you could say black race nationalism. It's race nationalism mixed with socialism. And the what comes out at the end of this sort of experiment or thought experiment is that the poor or the working class and a particular racial group are by definition the same thing. And if you are poor, it's only because you've been exploited or you've been oppressed. If you are successful, you can only be white. And it can only be because you have oppressed someone. And so it's this very, very one-dimensional conclusion that they get to at the end of the day. And there's no way that you can fix that without destroying things. It's not possible to fix. You can only try to fix it, this sort of conclusion that they have reached. But in your attempt to fix it, you can only make things worse.
Well, to play the tape forward with that, the logical conclusion is that these white people are infinitely, eternally going to be oppressors, no matter what they do. There is no way of breaking this cycle. and they can buy the land back, but the money that they use to buy back this land is from oppressing blacks generations ago, and they've got this generational wealth that's been passed down to them that we also need to address, and we need to get rid of that too. We need to maybe start taking their money, not just their land. And property isn't just this immovable force of your land, it's also whatever you have, your cars, and you can see how this can very quickly spiral. And I was at ARC a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I was at ARC this year as well.
I was there as well.
Yeah, I'm sure I would have seen you walking around. And a couple of years ago, I was producing the podcast Trigonometry at the time, and I was staying in this Airbnb in Greenwich by the O2 where ARC was. And I was staying in this shared place with the owners, who, one of which, they were both this black couple, and we sat down every night having these really deep philosophical conversations. It was amazing. And I found out during those conversations that one of them was the head of DEI for British Airways. And I'm producing Trigonometry at the time. I'm going to ARC.
You have your own views on DEI, yes.
So there's this Molotov cocktail for destruction that's about to go off. And I'm going to stand my ground. But no, we had a lovely conversation, and we sort of fleshed out each other's worldviews. And it was great. It was really polite. It was a courteous sort of debate that we had. I like to say I won. That was very clear after that. But that's not the point. One of the things that I realized, kind of working things out live during this debate, we went back to slavery and reparations and all of this justification for DEI that's been so widely implemented in the West. One of the things that I realized is that, in principle, I'm completely in favor of reparations. It makes complete sense, like you've alluded to earlier, right? And you'd be quite an immoral person not to be in favor of reparations. The problem comes with the implementation. And the conclusion I sort of came to in that moment was that there is no other way of lifting up insert group that has been oppressed without just going about lifting up the bottom of society as a whole. Because otherwise, you have to discriminate against someone. And why your example is so concerning is that there is no way to break that chain of oppression.
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. And because through this ideological thought process, they've gotten to a point where it's not possible to address that problem, especially in the way in which they seek to address it. But you can take a step back and say, well, actually, the underlying problems, it's not that difficult to address. And the irony, of course, is from a conservative perspective or conservative economical perspective, oftentimes the solution is just for the government to do less, to just take a step back, not intervene more, but intervene less, and things tend to work out because people tend to find solutions naturally where the government is by definition an artificial solution. It's someone having an idea and enforcing it onto society, and usually that doesn't work. Usually when you give people space to move, they sort of find their way around things. But this idea that it's a never-ending thing, you can already see the groundwork for that being laid in South Africa. When, for example, the International Labour Organization at the United Nations has this view on what affirmative action should look like if you apply it. And it says that affirmative action can only really be legitimate if there's some form of a sunset clause. You cannot have never-ending affirmative action. In South Africa, it is never-ending affirmative action. There's no sunset clause, and they would explicitly reject the idea of putting a sunset clause on affirmative action or race-based policies in South Africa. And so the argument that we hear today is South Africa, so they would define oppression as everything that happened since the arrival of white people coming to South Africa. When I say they, I don't mean black people say that. I mean, these ideological people in power in South Africa, those in government or the politicians. And so they would say we have had oppression for hundreds of years in South Africa. Therefore, we would at least need affirmative action for hundreds of years in South Africa. And so you can already see that. And so the question is not, are we fixing society? Affirmative action, or DEI as it is called in much of the world, it has become this ideological thing. It's almost a religious thing, and you cannot be against it because that's the faith. The faith is DEI. And in as far as you reject that, it's some form of a heresy. And there's not even space to debate the possibility of not having DEI, because that's just how things are. That's just how things are supposed to be. And again, the point is, if you take a step back, if you read the works of Thomas Sowell that we mentioned, for example, and there are many other economists you can look at, you will see that it's not that difficult. But in South Africa, I know a few years ago, there was a poll by a think tank who they asked politicians to list their priorities. They would just say, what are your priorities? Give me a list from 1 to wherever. And they found that in South Africa, the notion of education was on average number 16 on the list of priorities for a politician. And so it's so obvious that education in isolation is not everything, because you need to have education within a sort of economic framework and all of that. But it's so obvious that education is a fundamental part of the solution. You cannot move a society out of poverty if you don't have proper education, if you don't have proper training and so forth. But in South Africa, that, if you ask them, is education important? Of course, they would say, yes, it is. But if you look at their priorities in terms of what they implement, what they spend time on, what they talk about, education is sort of a nice to have thing. In fact, in South Africa became famous for the slogan, liberation before education. That was the ANC slogan.
Wow.
So they actively undermined education during the apartheid days. But you can still see the remnants of that today, that education has become this sort of protest tool to say, before we have land reform, we're not going to have proper education, sort of holding it back almost as a carrot to say, we'll get to education once we fix all of these other things, not recognizing that you cannot fix these things without education. And again, so if you take a step back, it's so obvious that you need proper education and you need an economic framework where it's easier to start a business, not more difficult to start a business. It should be easier to appoint people, not more difficult as a result of regulation and all of that. It should be easier to do things in general, not more difficult. But if you go through this ideological thought process, you get to the point where you justify making things more difficult all the time. You justify moving education to the sideline, marginalizing education as a priority. You justify using race as a proxy for how people ought to be treated. And you convince yourself that if you do this, somehow society is going to get better, when there's no evidence that that's going to happen. And all the available evidence shows that you're making things worse. You're not making things better.
There's so much to unpack there. And just to hammer home the point from earlier as well, I think anyone would look at the fact that there is no way for white people to address the oppression of the past, even, play it forward 500 years, the chain keeps on going.
Yep.
Everyone would intuitively feel that something is off with that philosophy. It feels kind of anti-human and very unjust. But something that really interests me about South Africa is this flip compared to the West, with all of this DEI and oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And that's that there may be disagreement about the extent to which there is this narrative of white people being oppressors. Someone might say that that's exaggerated and people don't really think that. Regardless of that, there's not a narrative amongst anyone that the black people are the oppressors historically.
Yeah.
And with that, it's the inverse to the West, in the sense that in the West, it's the same thing, right? But it's the minority that is being oppressed. It's black people, it's people of color, it's LGBT people that are minority groups. They say that they're being marginalized in the West. Whereas here, it's the majority group that's saying that. How does that dynamic sort of change the way people go about things?
That's a very important difference, and it's important to point out, because the argument for affirmative action or DEI and these type of policies usually is that certain measures needs to be put in place to protect minorities from being oppressed by the majority. In South Africa, it's flipped. In South Africa, the argument is we need to protect the majority from being oppressed by the minority. And why this is so important is what underpins this whole thing is leftist ideology and rhetoric. And this is important because in the West, in places like America and many European countries, a lot of people naively tend to think that, remember that we are the majority, so it's good for us to make some concessions just because these people are obviously angry. You can see that they are angry. They demand certain things. So we need to concede certain things towards them so that we can find some form of an equilibrium or harmony. But what the South African story shows is that making concessions because you are in the majority up to the point where you become the minority would certainly not lead to a point where these demands stop. In fact, what the South African story shows is if you become a minority, these demands worsen. It becomes more aggressive. And it's that old metaphor, this is also, I think, Churchill, but it might be someone else, who spoke about feeding the crocodile and thinking that if you just keep feeding the crocodile, eventually it's not going to eat you, or it's going to eat you last. But what actually happens is if you keep feeding the crocodile gets bigger and bigger. And so I think it's important when people are confronted with these DEI issues to take, and this is why, again, one of the reasons why people should learn from the South African experience is to take a stance as a principled matter or on a matter of principle, as opposed to simply looking at it from a tactical perspective and saying, well, I don't actually agree with this, but we are the majority, so let's concede to give away certain grounds or certain territory. And once you lose that, you lose it. And if you become the minority, again, it becomes more aggressive against you. And so the argument in South Africa, and it's up to the point where white people in South Africa are less than 8% of the population. And so now we have DEI policies aimed at discriminating against a 7% minority, claiming or suggesting that this 7% minority is somehow going to oppress everyone if you don't have DEI policies. And this obviously shows that surely there's a problem somewhere. But the question is, what is the problem? But it obviously shows that the policy is not aimed at addressing an actual problem or leading towards an actual solution. It's aimed at ensuring continued race discrimination. And the problem with especially the narrative in the West today is everyone can agree that when it's race discrimination against black people, that it's unacceptable. But once it becomes race discrimination against white people, then it becomes a debate. And maybe it's acceptable because remember the people we're discriminating against are white. And then it somehow becomes morally acceptable. And again, I think it's easier and it's just more appropriate to take a principled stance and say race discrimination is a problem by definition, as opposed to getting entangled into this sort of sliding scale tactical maneuvering, which only makes things worse.
What would you say to someone if they kind of came up to you in the street and they asked, Ernst, why are you focused on all this oppression of blacks versus white, all this vernacular about sort of who is the oppressor, whites being in charge, all of these policies that are supposedly racist towards white people now, when if you look at it objectively, the majority of these townships with very poor people, they're full of black people, right? Why aren't you worried about that? Why are you wasting your time just worrying about white people when they're the richer race in this country? Come on, where's your focus?
Well, I think the answer to that is that these policies, and that's the irony of the whole thing, these policies that are aimed at marginalizing white people and that proclaim to empower black people have the exact opposite effect. A lot of the poverty among black communities in South Africa that we see today is as a result of these so-called black economic empowerment policies, because what these policies do is they have nothing to do with actually empowering black people. They have nothing to do with actually uplifting black people or creating an economic environment where it's easier for black people to start a business, to thrive economically. All they do is they create a particular framework that renders black people in South Africa, especially poor, vulnerable black people, dependent on the South African government. And it happens not just in terms of poor black people. It happens on 3 levels. The first level is poverty, a real poor black people who need help. The way the government tries to help them is by giving them social grants. Now, that you can make an argument about when is it appropriate to give social grants, but it's certainly not helpful if you just have this massive system of social grants, but nothing other than that. Because what happens is it disincentivizes work. And so they become dependent on the government through grants. They get money from the government and then they keep voting for the ruling party, of course. The second sphere is in terms of the middle class, that becomes the black middle class becomes dependent on the government, or at least that's what they're trying to do, is to make them dependent on the government through affirmative action policies that says that within the workplace, within a work environment, you need to have policies that give preference to black middle class people as opposed to white middle class people. So there's race discrimination through affirmative action. And then the third level where that happens is the black elites who get these million or billion rands or dollars or pound, which currency you want to use, contracts because they are black and because of BEE rules, as we call it in South Africa, which is Black Economic Empowerment Policies, that says if a business is not owned by a black person or by black people, you cannot have these big deals and you cannot have deals with the government and so forth. So these policies that proclaim to uplift black communities encourage government dependency for the working class through social grants, for the middle class through affirmative action, and through, you could say, the elites through BEE deals and so forth. When none of these have anything to do with actually empowering people, it has to do with making them dependent. But the other side of the irony is that white people in South Africa have become wealthier after these black economic empowerment policies became implemented. Not all, some, at least on average they did. So what happened is we now have this problem of white poverty in South Africa, white squatter camps and so forth, which tend to be hidden. You don't see them next to the highway. It's usually on private property and so forth. But as a result of these discriminatory policies, a lot of white people who had sort of a safe position in some middle class position, or they worked for the government or something, they were forced out. And the ironic consequence is, to survive, they had to start their own businesses under difficult circumstances. And so they were forced into becoming entrepreneurs. And the consequence, or a consequence thereof, was many of these people actually became wealthier because of the oppression, because of the fact that they were marginalized, because now they had to find alternative ways of making money. And they figured out that, well, maybe I can actually start my own business. I can start my own factory. I can do whatever from home. And so this is the strange irony, is the fact that a lot of white people became wealthier as a result of black economic empowerment laws, and a lot of black people became poorer as a result of black economic empowerment laws.
We're running out of time, and I think it's good to end on a positive and try and look for solutions to all of this, although Thomas Sowell would say there are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Yes.
The thing that fascinates me about South Africa coming here is this rich, complex history that's also fairly short, or at least what we discuss is fairly short. And I think that there's so much that the West can learn from South Africa, and that South Africa can learn from itself.
Yes.
So I'll definitely be doing another sort of podcast tour here to really delve into these issues deeper. How do we move forwards? And I mean, you speak about the ship sinking in South Africa. How do we plug those holes? What can the West learn from South Africa? And, you know, I think that all of this stuff around race and politics and oppressors versus oppressed, you know, if South Africa can crack that nut, I can very easily see how the West can follow. So this is a very important battle to be fighting. Yes. And I appreciate you fighting it.
Yep.
How do we move forwards?
So I'd like to start my answer to that question by talking about the European experience, not as a European, but as someone who has spent time in Europe and who likes reading about the European experience. And I know Douglas Murray once remarked that maybe the defining feature of our generation, sort of in the broad sense of the word, is that we're still trying to make sense of the Second World War. And maybe, and I think that's true, I think we haven't even started to make sense of the Cold War, at least the conclusions, what we can conclude from the Cold War. And I'll say something about that. But just today, I mentioned the Second World War because just today in one of the Afrikaans news outlets, there's an opinion piece reminding us about the important lessons about the Second World War. And it was ironic to me because the conclusion is the same conclusion that people have been saying since 1950. And that is that the World War taught us about the danger of nationalism and the danger of communal identity. And I actually think that's the wrong lesson from the Second World War. There certainly is a danger to nationalism. It can be taken too far. If the lesson from the Second World War is that community identity by definition is a bad thing, I think it's a very bad lesson to take. Obviously, the idea of community identity can become a destructive force. And that we saw in Europe in the Second World War, and we've seen it in other places all over the world and throughout history. But the response to the Second World War, to a large extent, and the response to the Cold War, became this end of history ideology that we have now gone through these horrible things and we have now found the solution. And the solution is that actually we're all the same. Actually, we're all just individuals. We're not more than that. And the final solution, to use that term, is liberal democracy. And we should just apply that everywhere in the world and democratize the world, and then the world will be a happy place.
Francis Fukuyama's End of History.
Exactly.
Probably top 10 worst predictions of all time, we have to say.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. But the irony is that it had so much influence that people were so excited by this end of history idea. Looking back today, it was so obviously wrong. But you must remember, I mentioned this because that was famously after the Cold War, but also sort of with trying to make sense of the Second World War. And Francis Fukuyama is very important to the South African narrative because the South African Constitution was written at the height of this end of history idea, at the sort of high point of the popularity of the fact that we are now at the end of history. And we can so clearly see that that didn't work. And again, you can read the South African Constitution and see it's a brilliant document, and there's a lot that you can compliment about the fact that there are second and third generations of rights, and it's very comprehensive, but it just doesn't apply to reality in South Africa. And maybe a more extreme example is Libya or Liberia, I think, famously has a constitution that's almost a duplicate of the United States Constitution. But that doesn't mean that the outcome of that political system was the same as the United States. And so I think the wrong lesson from the Second World War is the wrong lesson is to say that communal identity is a bad thing. And I think the wrong lesson from the Cold War is that the solution is liberal democracy for everyone. I think, and South Africa, to me, proves that. It proves that that's the wrong lesson from the Second World War and the wrong lesson from the Cold War. I think the experience in South Africa says that the correct lesson, let's say the correct way to interpret these things is to say that we need to return to some form of a healthy balance where we recognize communal identity, where we recognize culture, where we don't wage war on these things under some ideological pursuit of trying to, find some utopian society if only we can destroy things that divide people, when sometimes it's perfectly natural for some communities to want to do things in a particular way and other communities to want to do things in another way. The solution is not to try to destroy these things that divide them, if to use the loaded term, but to recognize that there are different ways of doing things, and the one isn't necessarily right and the other one isn't necessarily wrong, but to find a system in which there can be mutual recognition and respect and say, okay, well, we do it this way and you do it that way and let's cooperate. And I think South Africa became, unfortunately, a grand political experiment that didn't work. And I think there is hardly anyone left today who would regard South Africa as a success. When back in the 1990s, the whole world was excited about the miracle. South Africa was described as a miracle story. And I think we can differ among each other as to why this miracle didn't become a reality. I don't think there's much room left for trying to argue that South Africa is a miracle story. But we should at least have that discussion to try to figure out why did South Africa not become this miracle story. And we can reach different conclusions. I would venture to say that one of the important building blocks that was left out was a proper recognition of communal dynamics. And I think if we can take that, and if the rest of the world can learn that from South Africa, I think that's that would be an important leap forward.
Ernst Roets, thank you for coming on The Next Generation. Where can people find more of your work?
Thank you very much. So, well, I'm on social media. People can look me up there. And I also have a podcast on my own channel that we run. I'm involved with an initiative here in South Africa that is aimed at working towards a more sustainable political dispensation for South Africa based on these ideas. And if people want to support that, we would really appreciate that. But they can just look me up by my name on all the major social media platforms and they'll find the necessary information there.